Revelation 6 opens like a countdown. Seal after seal breaks, and each time a rider comes out, not stopping, not slowing down. Most people watching this passage get caught by the horses, the colors, white, red, black, and pale. They remember the colors, picture the scene, and move on to the next chapter. But there is a small phrase buried inside the third seal that most readers skip in half a second, and once you slow down and actually look at it, it changes what the whole scene is describing. Not famine in the way it usually gets preached, not total collapse, something narrower, something more deliberate, and something that still shows up in ordinary life the same way it showed up in this text almost 2,000 years ago. Stay through this one. The detail sits inside what the third rider is told he cannot touch, and by the end you will understand why that single line matters more than the horses themselves. This is not a passage about a single catastrophic event landing all at once. Read slowly. It reads more like a sequence, one condition setting up the next, each rider handed something specific to carry and something specific to do with it. Most retellings flatten that sequence into one general image of disaster. The text itself does not. It hands each rider an object, and the object is the instruction. Revelation is not a side book tucked into a forgotten corner of the New Testament. It closes the entire Christian canon, the last word after the Gospels and the letters, and this scene in particular, the opening of the seals, sits near the front of it, functioning almost like a table of contents for everything the rest of the book unpacks in more detail. Whatever these four riders are describing, the text treats it as central, not incidental. And Jesus is not describing what already happened when this vision is given to John. He is describing what is still ahead from the perspective of the one seeing it. That matters here more than in most passages, because it means the scene was never meant to be read as history. It was handed to a persecuted first-century audience as something still coming. And every generation since has had to decide what to do with that. That is also why this particular chapter carries weight that a stray verse from a minor letter would not. It is not being pulled out of context from an obscure corner of Scripture. It sits inside the same book that closes out the entire canon, describing a sequence its own first readers were told to take seriously. Not as far-off legend, but as their own unfinished future. Before we open the seals, one at a time, a quick check. Revelation 6 is a chapter a lot of people have heard about without ever reading closely. Drop a yes or no in the comments. Have you actually read this chapter start to finish, on your own, outside of a sermon summarizing it for you? I read every answer, and it tells me exactly which parts of this to slow down on in future videos. And if the idea of reading a familiar passage slowly enough to catch what it actually says, instead of what people assume it says, is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe. There is another passage getting the same treatment soon. Start with what the text actually says before any interpretation gets layered on top of it. Revelation 6, verses 1 through 8. A lamb opens a scroll sealed with 7 seals, and as each of the first 4 is broken, one of 4 living creatures calls out, "Come and see." 4 times. Each call brings out a rider on a horse of a different color, and each rider is handed something specific before he goes out. The first horse is white, and its rider is given a bow and a crown, and the text says he went out conquering and to conquer. The second horse is red, and its rider is given power to take peace from the earth, so that people would kill one another, along with a great sword. The third horse is black, and its rider carries a pair of balances in his hand, a set of scales, along with a voice announcing prices. The fourth horse is pale, and its rider is named directly, Death. And hell follows behind him, with power given over a fourth part of the earth to kill with sword, with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth. Read quickly. This looks like 4 versions of the same idea. Judgment coming in waves, horses as a stylistic device, colors as decoration. That is how most summaries treat it, and it is not wrong exactly, but it skips past something the structure of the text is doing on purpose. Every rider gets an object, a bow, a sword, a set of balances, a name. Nothing here is generic. The vision is specific about what each rider is holding and what each rider is told to do with it, and specificity in a text like this is rarely accidental. Most people who have heard of the 4 horsemen of the Apocalypse know the phrase without ever having read the 8 verses behind it. They picture chaos in one undifferentiated block. But John did not write chaos. He wrote a sequence, 4 distinct actions handed to 4 distinct figures, one seal at a time. And it is inside the third one, the black horse and its balances, where the detail almost everyone reads past is sitting in plain view. Here is the line. When the third seal opens, John hears a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures, and it says this: "Take a measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny, and see thou hurt not the oil and the wine." Read that once and it sounds like background noise, a market announcement dropped into a vision about the end of the world. Read it twice, and the shape of it starts to stand out. Wheat and barley, the staple grains, the food an ordinary household actually lived on, are being sold at a price high enough that the text needed to specify it. A measure of wheat, roughly a day's food for one person, for a penny, roughly a day's wage. Everything a working person earned in a day, spent on enough grain to feed themselves for that same day, with nothing left over. That is not comfortable pricing. That is a household living at the very edge of what it can afford. And then, in the same breath, the same voice adds a second instruction that most readings skip straight past. Hurt not the oil and the wine. Oil and wine were not survival food in the way wheat and barley were. They were the comfort goods, the pressed olive oil used for cooking and light and anointing, the wine used at meals and celebrations, the products that came from orchards and vineyards, not from the basic grain fields that fed the poor. And the rider carrying the scales, the one setting the price of bread at the edge of survival, is specifically told to leave those 2 untouched. This is the detail almost everyone reads past. Not because it is hidden. It is sitting right there in verse 6, in plain King James English. It gets skipped because the eye moves fast over what sounds like a strange little market detail wedged between a bow and a sword and a name like death. But slow down on it, and it stops sounding like decoration. It starts sounding like the most specific, most deliberately worded line in the entire scene. Here is what changes once that detail is taken seriously instead of skimmed. Most retellings of the 4 horsemen lump the third rider in with a general picture of famine, as if the black horse simply means everyone starves. But a famine that starves everyone does not leave room for a rule about which 2 goods stay untouched. A total famine touches wheat and barley and oil and wine alike, because a total famine does not negotiate. What the text describes is narrower than that, and more unsettling for being narrower. This is not universal collapse. This is controlled scarcity. The basic grain that ordinary households depend on is priced at the edge of survival, while the goods associated with comfort, trade, and a certain standard of living continue moving untouched through the same marketplace. 2 categories of goods, 2 different outcomes, inside the exact same economy, under the exact same rider. That is not the picture of a famine hitting a population equally. That is the picture of a system where scarcity is being applied selectively, where the pressure lands hardest on the people who were already living closest to the edge, while the goods tied to comfort and status keep flowing. Look back at the other 3 riders with that same attention, and the pattern gets sharper, not softer. Conquest by the first rider, the removal of peace and killing by the second. Then at the third seal, not open destruction but an economy bent, prices moving in a way that starves one group and spares another inside the same marketplace. It reads less like a single catastrophic blow and more like conditions tightening in stages, each stage doing something the one before it did not. The 4th rider, death with hell following, is the one who arrives last, not first. The scene is building towards something, and the black horse is where the building starts to show its shape most clearly. It is worth pausing on why a vision meant to warn a persecuted first-century church would spend its precision on a grain price instead of a battlefield. War and conquest were already familiar to that audience. What was worth naming carefully, in a way the earlier riders were not named, is the subtler condition, an economy that keeps functioning, that keeps selling wine and oil to those who can afford it, while quietly pricing out the people at the bottom. That is a harder condition to notice than a battle, because nothing about it looks like a crisis from the outside. The marketplace is open. Trade continues. Only the ones being priced out feel the seal has broken at all. Now hold that pattern next to the world you actually live in, not as a claim that any one event is the fulfillment of this seal, but as the kind of pattern the text says to watch for. The exact shape described in verse 6, the price of basic necessities climbing while goods tied to comfort and leisure keep moving without the same pressure, is not a strange or foreign idea to anyone paying attention to their own grocery bill in recent years. The pattern shows up as a certain kind of gap, a household budget where the cost of bread, rice, eggs, cooking oil, and rent climbs in a way that eats a bigger share of a person's income year over year, while other categories of spending, travel, entertainment, luxury goods, keep finding buyers and keep expanding. It shows up as headlines about record profits in some sectors landing in the same season, as headlines about families choosing between groceries and heat. Nobody has to name a company or a government for this pattern to be recognizable, and this video will not name one. Naming a single institution as the fulfillment of a 2,000-year-old seal would be claiming a certainty the text itself never claims. What can be said is narrower and, honestly, more useful. The Bible described a specific kind of economic distortion long before modern economics had language for it, a scarcity that is selective rather than total, and that exact shape keeps recurring across history in different forms, in different centuries, under different names. That recurrence is not proof that the end is near. It is proof that the pattern named in Revelation 6 is not a one-time historical event locked in the first century. It is a shape Scripture flags as something to recognize, something that shows up again and again wherever an economy tightens unevenly, and something worth noticing the next time it shows up in your own receipts rather than someone else's headline. History gives this shape more company than most people expect, without needing a single modern example to make the point. Grain shortages paired with untouched luxury trade show up in accounts of empires long before this century. In famines where staple crops failed, while imported comforts for the wealthy kept arriving by ship. The mechanism the third seal names is not a one-time invention of the modern global economy. It is a recurring feature of how scarcity gets distributed whenever a system under strain still has room to protect some of its trade while squeezing the rest, which is exactly why a first-century vision could describe it in language that still reads as familiar today. Zoom back out to all four riders together, because the balances only make full sense once they are read as one piece in a sequence, not as an isolated verse. Come and see. That phrase repeats 4 separate times, once before each rider, and it is worth noticing that a living creature has to call each one out individually. They do not arrive together in a single wave. They are released one seal at a time, each one waiting on the one before it. Conquest first, a rider going out already carrying a crown, already positioned to win before the fighting starts. Then the removal of peace, a great sword, people turning on one another. Then the balances, the scarcity that lands unevenly, wheat and barley strained while oil and wine keep flowing, and only after all 3 of those, the fourth rider, carrying a name instead of a weapon, death, with hell close behind him, and the reach of that 4th seal specified as a 4th part of the earth, not the whole of it, working through sword, through hunger, and through the beasts of the earth. That sequencing matters more than the individual images do. This is not 4 unrelated disasters listed in no particular order. It is a build, conquest creating the conditions for lost peace creating the conditions for strained markets creating the conditions in which death, in all its forms, finds an opening. Each rider does not erase the one before him. Each rider is handed the ground the previous one prepared. Matthew's Gospel describes something with the same shape, wars and rumors of wars, then famines and pestilences, one condition setting up the next, rather than a single event landing out of nowhere. Revelation 6 is not describing chaos without order. It is describing an order to the unraveling, and the balances in the third rider's hand are the hinge point where that order becomes hardest to explain away as coincidence. One more layer worth sitting with before moving on, because it is the one that brings this closest to home, rather than leaving it as a description of markets in the abstract. The balances are held by a rider, a person, an agent, making a choice about what to strain and what to protect. That detail gets lost when the third seal is treated as an economic forecast instead of a warning about discernment. Ask a narrower question than what will happen to prices. Ask what gets treated as essential and protected in a season of pressure, and what gets treated as expendable and squeezed. In a household, in a budget, in a set of daily choices, that same balance shows up in miniature. What gets cut first when things tighten, and what keeps getting funded no matter what. The rider in Revelation 6 is not describing a chart of national inflation. He is describing a principle about where pressure lands and where it does not. And that principle is visible at every scale, from an empire's grain markets down to a single kitchen table deciding what stays in the budget this month. This is also where the passage starts pointing past the world outside the window and toward the person watching. The Four Horsemen were never given to first-century readers as a spectator sport, an event to observe from a safe distance. They were given as something to recognize, something to be sober about, something that changes how a person pays attention to their own moment, rather than just how they interpret history. That shift, from watching the world to watching yourself watching the world, is where the rest of this video is headed. Put all of that together, and the reason this detail gets read past so often becomes easier to explain. Revelation as a whole gets treated by a lot of readers as poetry, big symbolic pictures meant to be felt rather than studied line by line. Dragons, trumpets, bowls, numbers. Against that backdrop, a line about grain prices and untouched oil sounds almost too mundane to matter, so the eye slides off it toward the next dramatic image. But mundane is exactly the wrong word for what verse 6 is doing. A vision that wanted to stay purely symbolic did not need a specific price for a specific measure of grain, and did not need a specific instruction protecting two specific goods. Those are the marks of a text being careful, not a text being vague. The bow, the sword, the balances, the name death, none of them are chosen at random. And the balances carry the most precise language of the four, because the balances are describing the mechanism, not just the outcome. Conquest and war are outcomes. A price fixed at a certain level while two other goods are shielded is a mechanism, a description of how pressure gets applied and to whom. That is the whole answer to what almost everyone reads past. Not a hidden code, not a secret meaning waiting to be decoded by someone with special insight. Just a sentence most readers move through too quickly to notice how specific it actually is. Sitting inside a passage, everyone assumes they already know because they know the phrase, Four Horsemen. Slow down on the sentence, and the passage stops being decoration for an end times movie poster and starts being what it was written as, a warning built with more precision than it usually gets credit for. Everything up to this point has been about a scene in an old book and the pattern it describes in the world around you. What comes next is not about the horseman anymore. It is about the person watching this video. Before going further, one thing has to be said plainly, because it is easy for a video like this to drift toward implying more than the text supports. Jesus himself, later in the same gospel that records these warnings, says this directly. But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. Matthew 24, verse 36. Not the disciples standing right in front of him, not the angels. Nobody but the Father knows the day or the hour. That line was not written as a disclaimer tacked onto the end of a sermon to cover the preacher. It is inside the same discourse where Jesus describes wars, false Christs, and the very kind of pattern this video has been walking through, and it functions as a limit built directly into the teaching itself. Whatever the four horsemen describe, whatever the balances in the third rider's hand are pointing toward, none of it comes with a calendar attached. Anyone who tells you they have worked out a date, a year, or a countdown to when this pattern reaches its conclusion is already contradicting the very text they claim to be interpreting. So nothing in this video is a countdown, and it was never supposed to be one. Reading Revelation 6 closely is not the same as calculating an end date from it. It is learning to recognize a pattern the text names, without pretending to know the one piece of information the text itself says has been withheld from everyone except the Father. So what actually changes for someone who reads the balances the way this video just did, instead of skimming past them? Not fear. Fear is not what the text is asking for, and fear rarely produces careful attention anyway. It produces panic, which is closer to the opposite. What changes is attention. A person who has actually sat with what the third rider is doing, starts noticing the same shape in smaller places, the pull between what gets protected and what gets squeezed, in a budget, in a season, in the news that scrolls past without slowing down for it. It is not pointing to an event, it is training a way of reading, and that carries over into how a person reads their own life, not just an ancient scroll. Being ready, in the sense this passage actually asks for, looks less like stockpiling supplies for a disaster, and more like staying awake to the ordinary, everyday shape of pressure long before it becomes a headline. Noticing before everyone else notices. Naming a pattern instead of being surprised by it. That is available to anyone willing to read slowly. It does not require certainty about dates or theories about which government or which system fulfills which seal. It requires the same thing the vision itself required of John, close attention to what is actually written, rather than what people assume is written. The rest is left where the text leaves it, in the reader's hands, not in a countdown clock. Think of it less as a warning about a distant future and more as a habit for the present one. The next time a price feels wrong, or a season feels unusually tight in one place and untouched in another, that is not a moment for panic. It is a moment this passage already prepared you to notice calmly, the same way John was told to watch a rider come out and simply see what he was carrying. Go back to where this started. Revelation 6 opens like a countdown, seal after seal, rider after rider, and it is tempting to watch it the way most people do, caught on the colors of the horses and moving past everything else. But the countdown was never in the colors. It was in the balances, in a voice specifying exactly what to strain and exactly what to spare, hidden inside a verse plain enough for anyone to read and easy enough for almost everyone to skip. Before you go, same question as before, one word in the comments. Have you read Revelation 6 on your own, start to finish, outside of a summary? Yes or no, that is all, and I read every single one. If this kind of close, patient reading of a familiar passage is something you want more of, subscribe and hit like on your way out so the next one finds you. There is another seal, another detail hiding inside a line everyone thinks they already know, and it is coming next. This chapter will still be sitting there the next time you open a Bible, the same 8 verses, the same 4 riders, the same line about wheat and barley, and oil and wine. What changes is not the text. What changes is whether you read past that line again, or whether you finally slow down on it. The horses were never the point. The balances always were.